from him while we tried to teach him how to read his language. We'd use this little solar audio player so he could hear his Dendi Zerma language, and he heard it. And before our literacy class, we'd listen to several chapters or chapter depending on the time. And as he heard it, truth was beginning to dawn upon him. And he said, "Chimi chimi," which means truth, truth. It's like, wow, God is good. So there are two aspects to this message. One is the very first half of these verses that complete the second part of chapter 2. And one is that Paul rebukes Peter. Why? Paul? Wait a second. Paul is the last to become an apostle. He didn't see Jesus in those 3 years. How could he dare to rebuke Peter, the lead of the disciples? But he had seen Jesus on the road and had a vision of him and was changed. He was a man impassioned to keep the truth of the gospel, and he was willing. The apostle Peter, hypocritical in this passage. Why? Now, this there's also a church that sent where the disciples believers, whereas the church in and Paul stood condemned for before in Jerusalem, himself fearing. When Peter first arrived in Antioch, he ate his meals with the Gentiles who believed that Jews should not assume Gentiles. But when there's Antioch, Peter and the Gentile believers the church in Jerusalem, where James was one of the main leaders. Peter had Jewish believers were free Gentiles. We know that. We studied there about the vision that the Lord gave to Peter to prepare him to go and preach the gospel to Cornelius and his Gentile relatives. God had even given Peter a vision, right, to make clear how he was to relate to Cornelius, who was to come. And if we look at Acts 10, you don't have to turn there, I'll just read it to you. On the next day, as they went on their journey and drew near unto the city, Peter, with his traveling companions, went up upon the housetop to pray about the 6th hour, and he became very hungry and would have eaten. But while they made ready, he fell into a trance and saw heaven opened and a certain vessel descending unto him. And it had been a great sheet held at the four corners and let down to the earth. And he saw heaven opened and a certain vessel descending unto him, and it which were all Peter kill. And he had never eaten anything. Again, the second sentence, thou should not be or his hypocrisy on the 10th. They might hold. And that's why Paul, with boldness, challenges him. So verse 14, Paul says, but when I saw that their conduct was not in line or in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile, not like a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live like Jews? So before those men came, he was eating with the Jews. He was eating with the Gentiles. But those Jews came that he knew were, how can I say it? He was fearful of what they would think. So he separates themselves, acting as though the Gentiles were wrong and should be living like Jews, eating their food. But because of that, Paul rebukes him. publicly before all. Now, Matthew 18 says, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Considering this verse, it's important to understand why Paul rebuked Peter before all of the others. It's because Peter's sin wasn't just against one particular brother, but against the whole church, and the Gentiles in particular. The whole church had witnessed that Peter had separated himself from the Gentile believers. So as an apostle and leader of the church, Peter had set a bad example for the church, and in doing so, had led some astray. Even Barnabas, Paul's right-hand man, was led astray. That son of encouragement, Paul's right-hand man. So that's why Paul needed to address this to all and for our example. So the purity of gospel is maintained right from the beginning. 1 Timothy 5:19-20, against an elder receive not an accusation unless before 2 or 3 witnesses. Then that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. And that's where Paul is addressing it. Straight on, not pulling any punches. Now, Paul rebukes him for hypocrisy. In Greek, the word is hypokrites, however you pronounce that. Or that's an actor, somebody on stage, a stage player or character, one who feigns or fakes it. And Paul sees this in Peter, and he goes right to it and nips it in the bud. Hypocrite is used, interesting, 11 times in the Bible. And more than half of them are found in the book of Job. 6 of them or so are in Job, which is interesting. Why? Think of the story of Job and what God says